Hey everyone, welcome to Political Capital, your best weekly political show on all things in and around the legislature and BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw from the Check News Studios here in Victoria. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, the audio portion of this podcast is extended, lots of extra topics, and you need to subscribe to that through your various podcast feeds on the Googles, Apple, Podface, Spotify, whatever it is that you get directly into your ear holes each and every week. We are on that platform. I promise you. I've checked it out. I have reviewed the various metrics on the series of tubes that is the internet, and we are there. So you want to subscribe to that. But also, we're making a debut on television this week on Check News. Varying times. Consult your TV guide for the latest VCR Plus code on that. And we're on YouTube, on the Check News YouTube and Facebook pages as well. So lots of different ways to consume the show this week. Let me bring in the panel, as always. We're going to go around the table and start off. We got a bunch of different topics to get to this week. Katy Merrifield, strategist for the previous Liberal campaigns, Vice President of Wellington Advocacy. Thank you for being here, Katy.
BC Liberal. Happy to be here.
Yeah, that too. Jillian Oliver, Green strategist extraordinaire for various campaigns. Thank you for being here, Jillian.
Thank you for having me.
And Maclean K, editor-in-chief of the Orca.ca. Hello, Maclean.
Hello. Gotta renew my subscription to TV Guide, I guess, but I'm happy to be here.
Got to get it in print. That's the easiest way to get it. And you just kind of put it there and you flip through, and it's fantastic. It's still out there, TV Guide, by the way. I've seen it.
The last one I have had Mulder and Scully on it, so maybe that hasn't changed.
Well, they came back, so it hasn't changed. So we're gonna look. There's a ton going on here. We're gonna start with once again, not the vaccination/COVID file, because full disclaimer, only 3 of us are doctors, and so we cannot provide medical advice. Maclean flunked out of med school, and that's fine. But we can talk about the politics of the ever-changing government vaccination strategy. And this particular development this week was when we really got into a very thorny issue of who is considered a priority person, who is essential, who is a frontline designated worker, who is, in the words of Premier John Horgan, a hero in this province, and who, by extension of that, is not. And there were some distinctions made this week, including a list of frontline workers are going to jump the queue for the AstraZeneca vaccine starting in April, while the rest of us wait based on our age. That group includes teachers, childcare workers, first responders, warehousers, postal workers, grocery store staff, on, including correctional staff and people living in congregate housing like at a ski hill. So let's talk a little bit about that and that kind of announcement and maybe how that goes. I know there's been a lot of pressure from different groups on government to get into this. Jillian, what do you make of, I guess, both this announcement? There's a bunch of other stuff in it too, and kind of the considerations that have to be at play when a government announces something like this.
Yeah, well, so the provincial government sort of taking their recommendations from the federal National Advisory Council on vaccines, and these groups were not in the highest level of priority, just kind of based on the evidence around their exposure. But like you said, groups like especially the teachers have been pushing to be moved up the line. This is the same in other provinces where teachers organizations have been pushing for this. Last week, I think we saw some WorkSafe BC data that showed that elementary school teachers have been submitting more WorkSafe BC claims, suggesting that they have been at higher risk of COVID exposure. So I think the province was starting to feel the pressure mounting. And I think, the teachers put out a positive statement. It was an interesting statement. I was looking at it because it kind of really didn't go out of its way to really overly congratulate the government. It talked about the grief and the stress that the teachers have endured and how hard that's been. And then in the last sentence, thanks the education minister for her work. So, I think that they talk about a sense of relief. I think that's real. And I think we'll kind of see the end of that, the issue itself for now. But I do think there might be a little bit of residual hurt feelings because of how much work they've had to put in to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, teachers have been relentless, either in a good way or a bad way, depending on your view of fighting for their rights and improvements of their working conditions. And that, I think, must have played some role in them being included in a list above and beyond, for example, utility workers, people keeping the water clean, the gas on, the lights on, the ferry workers. They're not on this list, but the teachers are on this list. So those are interesting dynamics. I don't know if how we kind of break those down. Katy, did you have any thoughts on what you heard from government this week?
Yeah, I think this is a lesson in effective campaigning and union advocacy. As noted, I think the award for the most effective advocate goes to Terry Mooring, the head of the BCTF. Clearly, she's been beating this drum for a number of weeks and months. She's constantly on the news. She has an empathetic narrative, and she's a pretty formidable communicator. So it wasn't surprising to see teachers on that list. You saw some negative backlash from folks like Graham Johnson of the BC Ferries Union. They're not included in this wave. And so I think he needs a lesson from Terry on how to win friends and influence people.
He called it getting kicked in the face, I think, on Global.
Yes, it was. That was significant. But I think overall, the strategic policy goal from government is pretty simple. It's get as many people vaccinated as soon as possible, be the best in the country, or at least as far away from the worst as you possibly can be. So I know these timelines have changed. Some people think they're a little bit in flux, but frankly, I don't think the government cares. It's just as long as you're moving forward and you're moving faster, that's the priority here.
Yeah, we're certainly moving fast. I mean, all the numbers and dates and timelines, and you're this age and call in at this time, poof, gone. Like in some cases, we've moved people up 2 to 3 months. We're now talking about vaccinating everyone by Canada Day, the first shot, not necessarily your second shot, which is 2 to 3 months faster than just a few weeks ago. Maclean, what did you take away of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, as the only non-doctor on the panel,
that's right. You should have studied harder in med school, but I
should have or studied at all.
Yeah,
but it's important the government avoid. I'm not going to pretend that I understand or have any particular insight onto the risk factors in these different professions. I don't know, and I would suggest that most of us also don't. But what the government needs to avoid,
except you. But carry on.
What the government needs to avoid is the perception, whether true or not, that this happened because of lobbying. To Katy's point about the BCTF are the most active, aggressive, and in many cases effective union in the province. And so them moving up the queue will be seen by some, fair or not, as a victory of lobbying. The government doesn't want this. They don't want the idea that, if you want to get your workers moved up, you just need to be a squeakier wheel, because otherwise the next few weeks will be awkward and ugly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing the government doesn't want to do is really acknowledge when it changes things. It likes to just kind of portray everything as this rolling sort of tweak of what this is our original plan. We're just tweaking it a little bit, but there's a lot of stuff in here, including now the use of pharmacies that we've been, for weeks, people have been talking about. Why aren't we using pharmacies the way we use them to deliver the flu vaccine? And there's just baffle gab from Adrian Dix, the health minister, on why not. And then suddenly, whammo, there's pharmacies in the new plan. The online booking system's getting bumped up a week. If there is a trend line, it's that the more things change, the more government doesn't want to use the word change. They just kind of want to present it as, and I that might be good for public confidence. You never let on that you're ever changing anything. Everything is just the original plan, even if it doesn't look like it. I don't know, but we can come back to that. Well, does anyone have anything on that? I guess the not acknowledging change when change is happening, is that a thing?
I think that I would give them credit on this. This is a moving target. Like the whole pandemic has been that way, where we're getting new information. It's evolving all the time. And I think it's understandable. I think they've actually, I like the way that they've done it. They sort of had a very, very simple plan in the beginning, because they knew that they were going to be receiving more information, possibly more vaccine supply, as we saw the US is sending AstraZeneca vaccines, which is what made this possible, which nobody saw that coming until it happened, like just a few days ago, right? And so I think I actually think that this does help public confidence, because it's been a simple rollout. It's easy to understand, and I see it more as building on it as they go rather than changing things.
Yeah. Katy, did you have any last thought on that?
Well, just from a strategic comms perspective, it's always better to under promise and over deliver. The government really screwed up the first few days, as we saw, and they have been working tirelessly to rectify and exceed expectations since. Ultimately, on this file, all people care about is results. All people care about is getting those needles in arms as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter if the timelines have changed, as long as they're moving forward.
Yeah, and they're getting faster, and that's good. And we'll all look back on this one day and not even, it'll just seem like a distant memory, I guess. But it's funny how it takes up all the oxygen in the room, though, on a week in BC politics when it just takes over all the other files. But I want to move on to another topic here, which is the single largest increase to income and disability rates in BC history, announced this week. $175 a month added to those rates, which on paper sounds fantastic. I mean, that sounds like a huge win for the government. The problem is $175 is not $300 a month, which was what government was giving those groups as a COVID supplement and is now ending, cut in half in January, ending at the end of this month. So good move, bad PR, good PR. How do we kind of disentangle all of that, Jillian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how, like, the headline that the government would have wanted, single biggest increase, but it's not the one that they got in most cases, unfortunately, because the reality is this still keeps people far below the poverty line. And the government just had a panel that they spent a lot of time and money developing on basic income that recommended making the crisis supplement permanent and on raising assistance rates to the poverty line, which is, I think, about $1,800 in BC, as well as giving basic income to people with disabilities, which are included in this increase, which is not what they've done, and to youth aging out of care and women fleeing violence. So I think it's a huge investment. I think the government probably wishes they could have done more, but I imagine that they're preparing the budget like we talked about last week, and there's a crunch, and this is as far as they could go. So
yeah, it's a weird abstract number though, because it's not quite half of 300. It's $25 more than what it cut in half and it is being eliminated at the end of March. I don't quite know where the 175 comes from. It's going to cost $400 million, which is a lot of money, but it is a weird. I was struck a little bit by, didn't quite match up with what the number just came out of nowhere, I guess. I don't know. Maclean, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, to Jillian's point, it's the government probably did want and even expect the headline of largest single increase. But when it is going to be experienced by people who have been getting the emergency supplement as a cut, then that's the reaction you're going to get. And to Katy's point about vaccines, government should always be over, I'm going to screw up, but under promising and over delivering. That's the one. And in this case, it's going to look like the opposite, unfortunately.
Yeah. Katy, did you have a take on it?
Yeah, like, this is the challenge with any form of assistance that government says is temporary. It often morphs very quickly into an expectation of permanency for the people it serves. But to be crass, the vulnerability for left of center governments isn't on social policy, it's on economic management, and we are facing a $13 billion deficit. So I think the reason that they didn't go to the $300 supplement, in addition to the financial concerns, is because this is an area that the NDP can afford some political capital on. This is the third increase since 2017, the largest in history. And as a left of center government, they're going to get a free pass on caring for the most vulnerable anyway. So it's an area they can afford to, give a little less on.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Yeah, no, those are fascinating. They're interesting points, that it's hard for example, the opposition Liberals to jump in and say government should be giving the full $300 a month when we all know that is not what they would do if they were in government. So you get into a weird dynamic of people saying one thing, and it's but you're right. I think the NDP have split a line here to spend a little political capital on not giving people entirely what they wanted, but not blowing a gigantic hole in the budget although the budget is one gigantic crater at this point. So it's fun. It's funny to talk about the budget. We'll get into, the budget is coming in April, and we'll have a lot to say about it, that weird dynamic of gigantic deficits and what is economic prudence, what is tight control of your tax dollars, what is responsible government in an era of just infinite deficits. So we'll hang on to that one. Want to move on to Penticton versus David Eby, the David versus Goliath, except the David is the tiny guy, and I don't know. There's something there that you can figure that out on your own. Workshop it amongst yourselves. But essentially, you have the City of Penticton wanting to end and passing a couple motions in council a shelter, a 42-person shelter for COVID, for the unhoused, and David Eby, the Attorney General / Housing Minister, not wanting that to happen, exercising a very rarely used power of government, which it does have, to override municipal councils and say, we're going to continue to operate this thing despite your vote to the contrary twice. It's caused a huge kind of breakdown in communications. The mayor hung up on the Attorney General at one point during a phone call. The opposition brought it up in the House this week, calling the AG a bully for kicking around a municipal government. The AG said, I'm not going to allow 42 people out on the streets. It makes no sense. I'm not sure what to make of all of this. It leads into a very quick question of, I guess, can or should a province push around a municipality on a file, in this case housing, that it considers very politically important to Maclean? Is that the question, or is there a different question we should look at on this?
I think the way I would prefer to approach this subject is there's a false binary that's being put out there about this. It's that, either Penticton's all wrong or all right. This is a complicated situation. The lease for the housing, the shelter rather, in the church in Penticton was supposed to expire at the end of this month. And that was always the case. Penticton apparently was promised wraparound services would be there for the people there, which apparently were never delivered. And the surrounding businesses and that have experienced a significant uptick in crime and all that kind of thing. So that's where they're coming from. And apparently they had received no communication from BC Housing one way or the other. So the frustration was natural. That said, it's people who are sheltered currently who will be, kicked out onto the street. And as David Eby put it, you're just kind of hoping they don't form an encampment. So it's a difficult, complicated situation. And I would, if you're listening to this and you've made up your mind that, Eby's all wrong or the mayor of Penticton's all wrong, it's much more complicated than that. And there are no easy solutions here.
Yeah. And there's a political dynamic, too, from the premier, who clearly made the Attorney General the housing minister to end encampments. It was an election issue. It's now a political dynamic of, you can't allow these things to happen with another tent city to pop up in any community, because it reflects poorly on the progress the government is supposed to be making on housing affordability and sheltering and all of that. So there's that dynamic, too. I'm sure this is the beginning of a very aggressive stance from the Attorney General and the government on any municipality that doesn't do what this government wants it to do on housing, and have, maybe that extends to other topics. I don't know. Jillian, what did you make of all this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I remember being at UBCM in 2017, which is the meeting where all the local governments meet with the province. And there was sort of like this sense that like the relationships between local governments and the province had become so fraught, and everyone was so excited for a new era. And then, it's less than 4 years later, and we're starting to see these sorts of disputes raise their heads again. The province is also intervening in a court case with Doug Ford, where Ford fired or eliminated half of the wards in Toronto in the middle of an election, taking away basically half of their elected official seats in the middle of an election. And the BC is intervening in favor of provinces being able to maintain this sort of like broad purview over municipalities and local governments. And I think it's interesting, because I think that the province needs to remember that this is not just going to be the case for when they're in power. It's also going to be the case when they're in opposition. And there's going to be other issues. Of course, I think most NDP supporters, the caucus would agree, supportive housing, ending encampments is essential, but that this can be applied to all kinds of different situations, and that a heavy-handed approach might help you get things done in the short term, overriding local governments, but in the long term, it can create acrimonious situations and a lot of other problems down the road. So I think they need to recognize that sometimes working in partnership and sort of like using a little bit more carrot rather than stick can be a better long-term approach when it comes to dealing with local governments.
Yeah, it's really an up and down for local governments to have. They were at war with the Liberals and then supposedly made peace with the NDP, and now one by one. I mean, think of Maple Ridge and the housing situation that they went through and the disagreement with the province on that. And there's lots of examples of it kind of getting, the longer you're in power, the more fraught that relationship becomes. So, Katy, what did you make of all this?
This is going to shock people, but I don't really like what the Attorney General did here. You have Eby in the House freely admitting that this is a draconian measure, then gleefully pursuing it anyway, while at the same time having the audacity to say that, he's willing to work with Penticton Mayor and Council. Like, when I read this situation, it reminded me of that classic Reagan line of "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." The 9 most terrifying words to hear. Typically, as Jillian noted, the NDP does try to maintain a grip on municipal councils. They're often more left-leaning, but quite frankly, I think the political calculus here is that Penticton is a strong BC Liberal riding. So these relations are either unnecessary or they're frankly expendable.
Okay. Let's quickly go around the table on our hot take here before we wrap up the show. This is an interesting one, a new study from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives saying hit the wealthiest people, those who make more than $220 million, with a 1% tax and generate $10 billion in revenue. We got a minute to go around the table. Taxing the wealthy for improving inequality, good idea, bad idea, Maclean?
A fine idea in principle. I'm not sure if it would actually work out as projected. I'd like to see the study.
Okay. Jillian?
Yeah, agreed. Good idea. And I think an opportune moment, because this is the first time we've seen an American administration that would be willing to partner on something like this. A biggest barrier is sort of like tax and wealth fleeing the country and going to offshore havens. So we need international partners on this, and we might have one in the Biden administration. So it's time to act on this, I think.
Okay. Katy?
This is a loaded question, but my initial reaction is, no, I'm not really interested in social engineering under the guise of a great reset. And I'm also not into taxing prosperity.
Okay, the 1% tax isn't quite the greatest reset ever, but okay, that's fair enough. We're around the table. We can talk more about that on the podcast as well if you want to tune in. We've got a lot more coming your way on Political Capital. Thanks for watching on the TV show. We'll see you next time.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.